Welcome to the RSNA RadioGraphics podcast mini-series, Choosing a Career After Radiology Training. I am your guest host, Pouria Rouzrokh, from the Radiographics Trainee Editorial Board. In this series, we will be talking to radiologists about career path in academia and industry. Today, we are joined by Dr. Matthew Lungren, Chief Data Science Officer at Microsoft Health and Life Sciences. Dr. Lungren will share his journey in the industry and as a part-time academic radiologist. Welcome, Dr. Lungren.
Can you kindly tell us a little bit about this story of moving to industry, if how it started, what was the motivations behind that, and how is it going forward so far?
Yeah, of course. All journeys make sense in hindsight, but you really never plan it all. So the story behind that is interesting. So as you know, I was at Stanford for many years, and got to that level where you get your R01s, you start to establish a pretty strong, and then Stanford's one of the, I think there's only a few institutions left that do this sabbatical thing, right? So you reach this certain point in your career where you're eligible, I should say, to take a sabbatical. And so in late 2019, I was sort of looking around, and again, I looked at the typical thing, like, hey, spend a year with, a different institution in Europe or, South America, wherever, right? Just to kind of get a different perspective on clinical work, but also, of course, science, and learn some new things. And I was, flirting even with working at the NIH for a while, but then, I started to reach out to some colleagues and some collaborators I'd had in tech, and I just sort of said, hey, do you take sabbaticals, folks that are looking to do some work and cross learning, and surprisingly, every tech company I spoke with was really interested in that. So I did kind of have a few options, which was great. But at the time, there was someone named Greg Moore, who's also a radiologist, formerly of Geisinger fame, and then was at Google, and then ended up leading the Microsoft Health org. And so got in touch with him, and we hit it off. I mean, just an awesome guy, really smart, really has seen a lot of the kinds of things that I wanted to see as well. So I ended up joining Microsoft with him as my sabbatical. And so it was an incredible year. I essentially had what we'd like to kind of refer to as a hall pass to go anywhere I wanted in the entire org. So I was spinning up collaborations on AI and healthcare with even folks in the Xbox org, believe it or not, just all kinds of stuff. I ended up doing lots of projects, I think 26 in total during that time, and published a few papers and just had a blast. And I think I kind of came back with this realization that as much as I enjoyed, having a lab with, working with students, writing grants, I truly enjoyed those things. I started to feel like I was missing out on the opportunity to kind of scale, and, some of the things that I was doing. Not that I didn't feel like I was having an impact. It's just you kind of get addicted to the scale that these guys can bring to the table. And so I kind of made up my mind that I was going to move into industry, I think, at that point, but I did want to maintain a foothold in my clinical and academic work still. And so I kind of had to negotiate that a little bit. And so one of the first things I did was talk to the Microsoft group, obviously, and they were just at the time when they were acquiring Nuance. And it was unclear what the long-term personnel roadmap, budgets, et cetera, for that, what my role would be there. And so then I sort of looked at some of the other tech companies, got a few offers, but I think it was really difficult to work. It's not something they've ever done before, right? Which is to have a clinician who's working part-time, but also full-time with a tech. So it was kind of an odd request that I was making, right? But the folks at Amazon were super open to that. Believe it or not, I went through the full loop process that you probably hear about. It's very intense. You got to prepare for it. And then actually had to take all the cloud certification exams, believe it or not, too. I made it through that. And I really just, I can't overemphasize how much I learned working at Amazon. Incredible organization, incredible culture. No matter what you do in your day-to-day life, never sleep on them. They are just an incredibly efficient, powerful organization. And I was really starting to make some traction, but I got a phone call about 6 months later. The acquisition had completed. A lot of the folks that I'd worked with were just like, hey, we really just, things are moving in a direction where we need someone that can operate at the intersection of the research, what's coming, understands cloud, right, which I, of course, now did, right, which I hadn't before, and then finally understand the use case, the market, and by the way, we have a delivery mechanism via Nuance for the technology. And I was like, man, this is amazing. Because my one big complaint, I think, in general, was like, yes, it's cool to build services and solutions and even infrastructure ideas, right, about how we can transform medicine, but particularly in imaging. But yeah, I mean, I really kind of missed that idea of translation, And so anyway, kind of talked back and forth, and I just said, here's the things I'm interested in doing. I really want to work horizontally across all parts of the company. But by the way, I still need to work clinically. So it was a little bit of a negotiation, but ultimately it worked out for the best. And I have to say, this is a dream job for me because, again, everything that I'm doing almost entirely across the org is not just interesting, but I really feel like I'm seeing some technology that I never dreamed was possible.
Thank you. That was such a journey. I really enjoyed even listening to that. And let me ask you something. So I was looking at the kind of positions you had at Amazon and then now at Microsoft, and the positions themselves are also very interesting, at least looking at the title. So I mean, you were kind of consulting in the business matters to Amazon, right? I mean, you were helping them with business development. And then now at Microsoft, you're a chief medical information officer. So can you kindly explain a little bit about what is your day-to-day job in these roles, and how does that somehow contribute to that scale keyword you mentioned earlier?
I didn't really think much about the skill that I was building up when I was at Stanford. And the skill I'm referring to is just, I kind of came from certainly a very, very, very clinical place. And over the years working with Andrew and Pranav and all these folks, I started to be able to say, hey, listen, I became kind of a go-between, like learning enough about the technology, but then also having the clinical uses and trying to bridge those worlds, like, was my day-to-day for years, right? And then scaling that organization, which was, Amy Center, where we got to, I think, 300 faculty by the end of the time that I left. And I didn't even think about that being useful, just that ability to kind of, I guess, be a translator in some ways. And so when I was at Microsoft for the sabbatical, certainly I started to understand, hey, wait a minute. I jumped from one call that's all about clinical, and I jumped into another call that's all about research, and I'm able to code switch, and that was like felt normal to me. But then people would point out, like, hey, how did you know about that thing? Or, hey, can you help me understand where this technology might be useful? I was like, I can see why this is a valuable skill, which I hadn't really thought about. But so when it came to Amazon, you're right, it was very much a business development group in the worldwide public sector cloud. But still, what I had to do is I had to reach across the aisle and say, okay, I understand the clinical pain points. I understand what the clinicians want or need, a data scientist, whatever. And then I got to go in the org and find where that technology, who are the people who have the right prototype and abilities to bring those two things together. So it was very much what I was doing, right? But then on top of that, building a cloud justification, I guess, in some ways, to say, why would you go to cloud? Well, here's the things that this would enable. That was the value prop. And so today, like, I do very much that, except there's a slight accelerant, which is, of course, the OpenAI work, which is unbelievable. Again, I think my first week here, I got a chance to see GPT-4. Unbelievable. It just, it blew me away. I got existential. It was really, really a crazy time. And it's not stopped, right? So now you say, okay, I've got this brand new, rapidly evolving technology. I've got some of the components that involve research on that, right? Both in steerability, distillation, all these other all these are the things you have to deal with to make the model start to work in the cloud. And then you got to say, well, how do I make it useful for a use case? So that's kind of where I spend a lot of my time. It does tend to be dominated, frankly, by generative AI right now. But that's where you want to be right now, at least that's what I think.
That's awesome. I mean, the way that you were describing somehow moving between these different skills reminded me of a book by David Epstein, I believe, called Range, which talks about people who actually enjoy going from different disciplines back and forth, and finding their main value there. So that's something very, very surprising and astonishing. So Dr. Lungren, I know that you come from a very strong AI background, and we are going to talk about AI a lot in this podcast. But let me ask you kind of an introductory question, somehow, to make sure that we are not solely talking about AI. So, I mean, generally speaking, what are the kind of industry opportunities that exist for people who come from a radiology background? Do they necessarily need to move towards AI to join industry nowadays, or is there any other opportunities for them? How do you see the general cloud of opportunities there?
I get this question a lot. I think there's a couple of things that I think, I ask folks when they approach, because there's the part where you're we're all burned out in healthcare. if you're on the clinical front lines, with rare exceptions, you're feeling like you're at the end of your rope, right? And then so you kind of look around saying, where else can I make a living and I don't have to, deal with the kind of stuff that makes you want to not practice. I often say that it's still a bit of a square peg in a round hole if you're purely a clinician. And the reason I say that is that the most valuable work, the most impactful work that you can still do as a clinician is be a clinician. And right. And I firmly believe that. That's again why it's a non-negotiable that I maintain a practice. I still feel like that's important. And again, we spend so many years of our lives training to do something that isn't, obviously incredibly hard. But that doesn't mean that there's not opportunities to do other things with that skill set. And so I think that what I often tell folks is that reaching out to startups, keeping an eye on what's coming, and that doesn't have to be AI, like you said, it can be around new platforms, new infrastructure, new workflows, whatever those things are, right? There's all kinds of companies. It's a huge space, tons of investment. And, everyone recognizes, I think now, that the vast majority of the market in terms of healthcare core data lives in imaging, right? At least for radiology for now. So there's tons of opportunities, I think, and that's where you do have to be proactive. And again, one of the traps that a lot of folks fall into, even if it's not about AI, it's that they feel like they have to have some other degree or other MBA or, a CS degree or whatever those things are. I find that to be not at all the case. And I'm not saying it's not valuable at all. I guess in healthcare, we always have to feel like we have to have a degree to be able to be an authority, to be an expert in something. And that's a hard thing to shake, but it's not the case. And it's really experience. This is really a game of experience. And the other thing is really just reflecting on what you enjoy doing, because if you're just switching gigs and you don't truly enjoy it, like you're not intellectually stimulated, like you want to wake up every morning and just, you can't help yourself. You want to get involved and do X, then I don't know if it's a good switch. Maybe the switch should be part-time, right? Or something else, and not necessarily trying to break into a new field. So, but I often feel like the biggest surface area for opportunities for clinicians is still absolutely in the startup space. But then there's things like pharma, right? There's others that have moved into other large industries, payer and pharma, both good examples of places where there's clinical need, or at least clinical expertise need, right, across the medical imaging ecosystem. But as I like to say, it's always been luck. None of this stuff was planned. So I don't have like a roadmap. If you do X, you can do Y. I don't have that connection. It just, except for being in the right place, right time, and working hard towards things you enjoy doing.
As someone who has moved from the world of medicine to a riskier world of industry, what kind of skills, what kind of mindset do you think people should have? Either trainees or maybe graduated radiologists, senior radiologists. What makes a good candidate to take the path that you took?
Yeah, I mean, there's two things. I think that I see folks that want to jump out like right after med school or right after residency, and I run into them too. And again, they're often, everyone's smart, right? All that. But even though they're MD, quote unquote, or have maybe a year under their belt, they don't have, like, when you become an attending, like there's a feeling that you get that, again, maybe you don't feel it all the time, every case, but you feel it once in a while. And you're like, I'm responsible for something that majorly is impacting another person's life. And in that sense, that weight, that sense of responsibility, even frankly, obligation, and it's stressful. And things go wrong, I have to tell you, it's really stressful because you blame yourself. And if you haven't been through that, you potentially could underestimate the gravity of the work that we do as we try to bring new technologies into healthcare, because we sort of underestimate what that really truly means. And have you ever had that responsibility? And so I do say that putting yourself in a position where you're getting 4 or 5 years as an attending, whatever your specialty is, before you're really calling yourself truly an expert in the clinical world, I almost feel like it's mandatory. So putting that aside, then it's like, okay, well, what things do I need to think about? Or what I remember my first time in a meeting where something had gone wrong. They were putting together service, they missed a deadline, and one of the customers was super mad. And we were on this call, and I was like, the guy was upset, whatever, we're having a discussion. And at the end of the call, we did this debrief, and they're like, man, how are you not super stressed out? And I'm like, no one died. Like, my understanding of what stress is completely different. And the other thing that's also I've noticed, when you talk about people that are quote unquote grinding in the startup world or grinding in trying to really work super hard, I've yet to meet anyone who's worked as hard as anyone who's gone through residency, right? Or maybe in some cases med school, right? Like the amount of hours that we are capable of spending to do something is astonishing. It's an Olympic skill. And that is translates. So if you really like something and you have this capacity, almost an obscene capacity to do work, and then you have the skill set to really know your domain, that's an unbeatable combination in my opinion. Like if you said I had to be on a call at 5 a.m. and I'm going to go till my day's going to not going to end till 10 p.m. Okay. I've done that for years, right? Oh, you mean I have to work this weekend? Oh, shucks. Like it's not right. It's a totally different mindset. So you come to this and say, well, yeah, I have all of this ability and some of it's just innate. Like I have seen myself do harder things than what I'm being asked to do now. And there's a confidence in that, right? And again, those are those kind of like intangibles that I think physicians really can bring to the table, almost no matter what they're doing.
This is awesome. This is great. A very nice perspective. So you talked about how having 4 or 5 years of clinical experience can help someone moving into industry. Is it also the case with the kind of academic experience? I mean, doing research in the universities and teaching. Do you also see that component necessary for someone who is moving to industry, or something that can bypass?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I did all the academic stuff because I was truly interested. I would have done all that for free. Like that's how much I love doing that stuff. I really like writing papers. I was an English major. Like I really enjoy this. And so I wouldn't say you have to do it, because especially if you don't enjoy it, it's going to be even make your life more miserable. But academics is a double-edged sword. So on the one hand, some of the skill sets that you build up, communication, presentations, writing proposals and grants, writing papers, that is another really important skill almost anywhere. It's extremely universal, extremely useful skill. And that's a muscle that you definitely build up as an academic for sure. But there is a point that I've noticed that you get, like, let's say you've been now an academic for 10 years, 12 years, 15 years. For some reason, there's a bit of a reluctance to bring someone out of that world into an industry world. And I don't know if there's a stigma associated with that a little bit, but you sort of get insulated, right? You can start to kind of get that tenured professor aura on you. And that doesn't scream, hey, I'm willing to grind it and I'm willing to jump into a startup and really kill it, right? There's a bit of a disconnect. Now, I've seen lots of successful long-term academics start companies, 100%. Some of them even going off to be CEO of those companies. But there's a bit of a stigma that occurs at a certain point, I've noticed, when it comes to how long you've been, quote unquote, academic doc, because it is a life shift, right? You are completely, and as you said, taking a risk career-wise too. And that it's just not as common that you're willing to make that leap, I think, once you get pretty long in your career.
So, Dr. Lungren, who do you think is not a good candidate? I mean, speaking of radiologists and radiologist trainees, to consider the path to industry that you took. I mean, who should avoid that?
Yeah, listen, I mean, everyone's entitled to change their mind at any time. And there's nothing that says because you became a clinician, you always have to do that, or because you're not happy being a clinician, you have to go into industry or whatever there's no such thing. I could decide tomorrow that maybe I'm not enjoying it anymore. I do something different. I feel like you made this point earlier, but I think physicians are generally a very intelligent group of people that have perfected the art of deferred gratification, right? We like, oh, I just got to get through the step exam. Oh, I got to do, residency. Okay. Yeah. Like, and you just say, okay, I'm just going to grind to the next thing, right? We get on these tracks. And I think that we kind of condition ourselves. Well, I am a radiologist, therefore I can't do research in pulmonology, or I can't do basic science in a completely unrelated area. Like I see this all the time, these like very siloed ways of thinking. And I think there's plenty of reasons why that's good. But if you're someone that's interested in something different, I always ask myself, what is stopping me from doing something that's completely unrelated to my expertise if I'm interested in it? And I think that that's a trap that we don't even consider that option, And sometimes it's that whole thing, we put barriers in front of it, right? We sort of say, well, I'm interested in that, but I would need to get an MBA, or I would have to get a PhD. And that seems hard, that there's no way that's worth it, right? That's just not true. I haven't found it to be true personally, at least. And I think you see this all the time in the startup world too, right? You have folks that are doing several different jobs in some of these companies that they don't have formal degrees in, right? But they're learning by doing, in some cases, learning by failure, right? Which is another great way to learn. And that's how I learn. And being willing to drop the ego. And yes, you're not an expert in this thing, but you're not going to become one unless you start accepting the fact that you're not an expert. That beginner's mindset, right? If you can't let your guard down for 20 minutes because you've been building this identity that's like, oh, I'm an expert abdominal radiologist, therefore, if I feel uncomfortable if I'm not doing something different, that discomfort might be telling you something, that you might be learning, and so anyway, I know that's a kind of a very Silicon Valley thing to say, but if you're an intelligent person and you're interested in something, you should do it.
Thank you. Awesome. How do you balance these different roles, as a clinician, as an academician, and also as an industry kind of player?
I don't want to try to represent that I'm working as much as I did right when I was full-time academics, right? But I have to say that there's, just like with anything, you build up experience and skill. You kind of oh, hey, that's actually, I think that would be an interesting paper. You get that instinct, right? Or that's actually a good direction. We should tackle that because that's going to be useful for the world to know about. We should start working on that. And sometimes that's in industry where you publish, and I've done some publishing here. But then there's also still those connections you make. I mean, as part of a career, you have collaborations and friends and people that you can still work with. And so again, that was important to me to maintain some of that. But to be fair, I work about 1 day a week clinically. I don't pretend to be on the front lines in the same way that I used to be, right? And that's probably unfair for me to claim that I am still full practice, but I do enough to feel like I'm making a difference, and it's important to me. But the academic stuff, it's interesting how, at least in tech, those worlds have kind of started to blend, right? On the academic side, right, there's way more publishing and archive. There's almost a bit more willingness to collaborate in the tech world, right, between academia and tech. And those lines have blurred enough, I feel like, where it actually feels very seamless, to be honest with you. And we have tons of these academic collaborations. And then on the industry side, I think I don't want to go so far as to say publishing is marketing, but at some point, right, demonstrating that you've got a technology or a capability or a, whatever it is in a sort of peer review type way, when we actually do go beyond archive or go to a conference, there's value to the company in that too. And I think they've started to see that. And so I think that, again, those lines are blurred to the point where that's actually the easiest part of what I still do. It's really the code switching from 20 meetings a day about all kinds of crazy next gen whatever, and then jumping into healthcare where I walk by a fax machine and I'm still hunting and pecking to try to figure out how to write an order for or do a procedure. That gap is a harder code switch for me. But it's also really an important reminder that, as excited as we get about all this cool stuff, the reality on the ground is very, very different. And that, again, I sort of see it as a way to ground myself in, okay, so how far are we from reality when we're talking about doing X, Y, Z,
This is great. What are some of the main challenges that you experienced? Were there any moments that you somehow regretted coming to the industry and wanted to go back?
Well, I mean, I think that, so I look at all the different things that I do as, I used to do this in academia too. It's like a bunch of sine waves, right? In any task that you're kind of doing for a long period of time, there'll be moments of intensity and there's moments of less intensity, right? And I think of it as sine wave. And sometimes if you have multiple sine waves all going at once, things line up and, one thing's intense, but the other things aren't, and you can kind of manage everything. But there are moments when all three sine waves peak, right? I have a really crazy clinical day. I have 2 critical meetings I can't miss. I have 3 deadlines, whatever, and everything's hitting at the same time. So that is not my favorite time, for sure. But for the most part, it's just about kind of anticipating that. I mean, any academic clinician who's been doing it long enough recognizes that that's how life was before, right? You'd have your R01 deadlines coming up. You were on call the night before, experiment didn't work and you have to do a report, whatever those things are, they can all kind of peak at the same time, right? Your clinical and academic life. So very similar to that now. And that's, 100% can be frustrating, but I don't know how to say this. I really, really, really enjoy what I do, even if it's hard. And I don't know. I just I would like I would literally see this almost as a hobby, to be honest with you, in some cases. Not that I don't take it seriously, but just that I enjoy doing it so much that it doesn't feel like work. I guess that's the thing to say here, but that's true.
Awesome. And say if I am someone, a trainee who is very much interested in AI, but I'm currently maybe a radiology resident. I don't know any programming, but I'm very much interested into this stuff, and I'm doing my best to increase my technology literacy, as you mentioned. Is there anything that I can do to somehow accelerate AI development for healthcare, medical imaging, and somehow contribute to that? Somehow feel that I am leaving my fingerprint on that somehow.
Yeah, I mean, you're saying how can I have an impact actually in the development side? Yeah, I mean, listen, I don't encourage anyone to learn to code if they don't want to, if it doesn't sound interesting to them. I honestly don't know what the future need of that skill set would be, except for the core developers for a lot of this stuff. And that's, I mean, you probably saw the dev day today with OpenAI. You're starting to see where this future is going, and so. But in terms of like impacting, I think it's going to increasingly be the case where you, meaning the clinician as the consumer, will have a choice into which direction that they want to go. Like, how do they want to use this technology? And there'll be all kinds of different companies and all kinds of different offerings, and you have some autonomy there. And the more you know about the technology, the better you'll be prepared to make, the right choice. And that impact really will be using it, right? And maybe then seeing gaps that you could potentially fill as you use it. But as a resident, I always say this, and feel free to disagree with me, but as a resident, your number one job, number 1 through 10, is to become the best clinician that you can in that amount of time. You can learn 99% of all this stuff that's going on, computer science, whatever it is, online. What you can't learn is any of the things you're going to learn in residency online. Like, I don't care how many books you read about radio, you are not going to be the best clinician you can be. And so this is the only time you have in your entire career to get that knowledge and be really good at it. Because no matter what you do with it later, that you're going to rely on that core competency, because that's your identity and one of your skill sets, right? And you can't go back and just get it again, and that, I think, is sometimes we take it for granted. Like, we've gotten to this stage in our career. Okay, now I just got to crank out for the next 4 years to residency. You have to look at it differently. And it's easy for me to say as an old guy, but you have to look at it as like, this is my last chance to have access to knowledge and clinicians in this dedicated space that I will never get again. Right? You just won't. Like, you, as an attending, if I have a question, I have to then go find a colleague. I got to sit down and I got to ask. It's not the same, right? You're 20 plus hours a day. You're thinking, breathing, living this, and you're learning as fast as humanly possible. That is your only chance to do that. So don't take it for granted. It's sort of my, and then you can learn this other stuff later. You totally can. You can make changes later, whatever you're interested in. But I think that this is your moment, and you owe it to yourself, I think, is how I look at it.
Thank you very much. This is certainly a very invaluable advice. And so maybe as the last question on my side, maybe Jason has something to continue, but from my end, what kind of advice do you have, Dr. Lungren? This is more of a general question to those radiology trainees who are, very near to graduation, and they are still wondering what should be the future that they should, attend to. Some of them might be thinking of staying in the academia. Some might want to join the private practice. Some might, like you, think of joining industry. So there are a lot of things, a lot of directions that they're pulling them. What kind of advice do you have for those people?
I think the two things I would say is, number one, there's no rules that tell you what you have to do with your career. Once you're graduated, you're not bound to anything. Like, if you want to work 1 day a week, you want to work 7 days, whatever, like, find a way to know what you want, and then find a way to get that, whether it's right away or whether it's going to take a few years. I think that's number one. Number two is there's really very few permanent decisions that you can make. So in other words, you commit to you commit to going to academia. You do it for a few years and you don't like it. It's not the end of the world. It's not the end of the world. And just taking stock of your skill sets and your interests. And I would encourage you to do it even if you're enjoying what you're doing. Every few years, take a break and say, is this what I want to be doing? Or is there something else that I'm interested in? How do I pivot, and how do I make that that other thing possible. It doesn't mean you have to hate, you don't have to wait till you're miserable, right? To make a change if you want to do something different with your career. So again, there's the two things. Again, there's no rules. Like you are your own CEO for the most part. You may have a family support, you may have other obligations, but in general, you choose how to apply that skill that you've just learned. And then number two, whatever decision you make is very rarely is it a permanent one, right? It's only you that makes it permanent.
Yeah, that's certainly helpful. Thank you very much.
I would leave you on an optimistic note that the future is bright for radiology in general. I think we're going to have opportunities to really superpower our efficiencies and our capabilities. And I've never been more optimistic. So hang in there and learn as much as you can and prepare for the future.